Hey everyone, welcome to the 5th episode of my poorly funded YouTube show, Know Your History, and today I'm going to be discussing Abraham Lincoln's views on slavery. This is an important topic because, as we all know, Lincoln was the man who issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 by means of an executive order, which would free the slaves and forever change the lives of Black Americans in this country. Over the course of his lifetime, Abraham Lincoln's views on slavery seem to have changed gradually. There are many misconceptions regarding his opinions on the subject, namely because it seems to have changed so often between 1861 and 1865. Perhaps one of the most well-known quotes involving Lincoln discussing slavery came from a letter he wrote to Horace Greeley in August of 1862. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union, and what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. If you spend as much time on the internet as I do, you probably know this quote gets used very often to describe Lincoln's overall views on slavery, but this simply isn't the case. Abraham Lincoln died 3 years after this letter was written, and it is important not to overlook the context of how he would come to view slavery in the following 3 years that led to his death. Abraham Lincoln's views on slavery changed somewhat dramatically during a short period of time, and since the ability to be persuaded on controversial topics is the mark of a highly intelligent person, it should come as no surprise that after meeting with abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth in the White House, Lincoln's views on slavery were ever-changing and evolving. Pulitzer Prize-winning scholar of American history Eric Foner describes Lincoln's views on slavery as tumultuous and malleable.
Lincoln didn't exist in a historical vacuum, obviously. He's part of a spectrum of thinking on slavery in that era. At one end of the spectrum are the people we know as abolitionists, the Frederick Douglass, the William Lloyd Garrisons, the Wendell Phillips. These were people who demanded the immediate abolition of slavery and the incorporation of blacks as equal members of American society. Now, their role was very important in abolishing slavery. They were not a very large number, but they helped to change the public discourse about slavery, which is critical. On the other end, of course, are people like John C. Calhoun and others who just thought slavery was the best kind of system and should be permanent. But even within the anti-slavery spectrum, you had these abolitionists on one end, and on the other end, you had people who wanted to get rid of slavery, but thought it would be a long, long process. Lincoln once said it would take 100 years to get rid of slavery. They couldn't really conceive of blacks being members of American society. They talked of gradual emancipation, of paying the owners for their slaves, and very often of colonizing them outside of the country. Lincoln starts out at that end of the spectrum, but during his life, and particularly in the Civil War, he moves toward the abolitionist position. By the end of the Civil War, he's obviously presiding over the immediate abolition of slavery with no compensation, no payment to slave owners, even though slaves legally are property. And at the very end of his life, he's talking for the first time publicly of giving the right to vote to at least some African Americans in the South. So that's a whole different picture than sending them out of the country. Now they're going to be there as part of the political system. So what's interesting to me about Lincoln is how he moves along that spectrum. Too many people take one moment in Lincoln's career or one letter or one speech and they say, there is Lincoln. But you can't pin him down at one spot. That's part of his greatness. He grows, he changes. In a period of radical change, he himself is able to, rethink his ideas. And many presidents, including some recent ones, aren't able to rethink even when, events seem to suggest they may be on the wrong track.
Lincoln had spent time observing the way various European countries had gone about abolishing slavery, in particular Britain, and in the beginning of the 1860s, Lincoln wanted to colonize African Americans into their own nation, going so far as to sign an agreement with an unknown entrepreneur to settle former slaves on an island off the coast of Haiti. Like the vast majority of American whites at the time, Lincoln did not believe that blacks could coexist as equal to whites under United States law. Lincoln also felt constrained by the constitutional issues that surrounded slavery, Because slaves were legally the property of their owners, to free them would mean the United States government would have to forcefully confiscate the property of its citizens, a notion unthinkable to most Americans even today, although thank God the legal definition of property in the United States has changed quite a bit since Lincoln's time. Because of this, Lincoln at one point had proposed the idea of monetary compensation for slaveholders to alleviate the financial losses they would incur as a result of abolition, but the slaveholders rejected the proposition without hesitation. During the summer of 1862, records show Lincoln made the decision that emancipation was necessary for the Union both politically and militarily. On January 1, 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which effectively threw gas on the already precarious climate of the Civil War, as well as altering his own thinking on the overall morality of slavery. In November of that same year, Lincoln would deliver his most iconic speech of all time, the Gettysburg Address, where he highlighted the principle of the Founding Fathers that all men are created equal, declaring that the Union soldiers who had already died will not have done so in vain, and that America would witness a new birth of freedom. Comparing Lincoln's first inaugural address to his second one speaks volumes about his change of heart toward the end of his life. In his very first speech as president, Lincoln doubled down on a previous statement he'd made about slavery during his first campaign. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. In his second inaugural address, however, Lincoln seems to adopt a different attitude, clearly affected by recent events that had occurred during his first term. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South, this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Finally do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. This speech had been delivered just 1 month before Lincoln's assassination, and aside from the Gettysburg Address, is probably the best example of his evolving opinions on slavery from both a legal and philosophical position. During the last 2 years of his life, Lincoln also warmed up to the abolitionists, enlisting Frederick Douglass as a consultant and inviting other activists of his kind, such as Sojourner Truth, to the White House. Because most people saw the abolitionists as radicals, Lincoln was careful to never openly side with them, but there is ample evidence to show that he was slowly but surely becoming more sympathetic to their cause. Lincoln's views on slavery were incredibly messy and complicated as he battled with being complacent with current cultural norms and the drive to maintain peace and order in his country. He was initially forced into his title of the Great Emancipator by the circumstances of his time, but he eventually embraced his destined role in America's history. When asked to overturn or even just revise the Emancipation Proclamation in the interest of peace, Lincoln bluntly told one visitor, "I should be damned in time and eternity." That's all for today. All my sources and the script are going to be linked in the description below for your convenience, and if you have any questions or thoughts on the matter, let me know in the comments below. Bye.